The stagecoach rattled down the dusty trail that led toward the edge of nowhere, a scatter of wooden homes, a weather-beaten church, and one lonely windmill turning slow against the amber sky. Folks called it Willow Creek, though the creek had dried up years ago. The air smelled of pine smoke and horses, and every sound, wagon wheels, hammer blows, children's laughter, seemed to carry twice as far in that empty land. Out here a person could start over, or disappear entirely. That was why she'd come. She sat stiffly on the hard bench of the coach, gloved hands folded tight in her lap. The paper in her bag was already creased and soft from too much reading. A letter from a rancher who said he was seeking a wife, promising steady shelter, kind treatment, and an honest life under the wide western sky. She had answered the advertisement because there was nothing left behind her but silence. Her parents were gone. Her little boarding house room in St. Louis already rented to someone else. The man's letter had felt like a door opening. Now, with the coach nearing its stop, all she could think of was the sound of that door closing again, if this turned out to be another disappointment. Through the window, she saw a cluster of riders near the station, their hats tipped low, horses restless under the last red light of evening. One of them stood a little apart, tall and broad-shouldered, his shape clear against the horizon. She couldn't make out his face, only the way he moved, slow, sure, like he'd been part of this land since birth. Something in that quiet strength stirred a feeling she didn't recognize. Hope, maybe, or fear. The stage rolled to a stop in a whirl of dust. The driver called out names, tossed down baggage, and one by one the passengers climbed out. When her boots touched the dirt, she felt the tremor of it, this hard, living land beneath her feet. The tall cowboy stepped forward, holding his hat in both hands. He said her name softly, like testing a word he'd never spoken before. His voice was rough but warm, the kind that could command men or comfort a frightened horse. She nodded, not trusting her own voice. He wasn't at all what she'd pictured when she'd answered that mail-order advertisement. No fine suit, no polished boots, just worn denim and sun-faded leather. But his eyes, when she dared to meet them, were steady. There was a tired kindness there, the kind born from work and long silence, not from charm or habit. He offered to take her bag. She hesitated, clutching it like the last piece of her old life, then let him lift it easily with one hand. The small gesture felt larger than it should have. The town was already folding into night. Lamps glowed behind thin curtains. A dog barked somewhere, and the faint notes of a fiddle drifted from the saloon down the road. She could see faces watching her through windows, curious, maybe pitying. Everyone in places like this knew when a mail-order bride arrived. They'd whisper and measure her worth before she'd even unpacked. He led her toward his horse-drawn wagon waiting near the corral. "It's a bit of a ride to the ranch," he said quietly. "We'll make camp halfway. Tomorrow you'll see the land proper." She climbed into the wagon beside him. The seat was narrow, and every jolt brought their shoulders close enough for her to feel the heat of him, the steady rhythm of someone used to long silence. The moon rose silver behind a ridge of pines, painting the road pale. The night wind was cool, carrying the scent of sage and river dust. For a while, neither spoke. Then she found herself asking how long he'd lived out here. He told her his father had built the first cabin before the war, that the land had been both friend and enemy since. He'd lost a herd to drought, a brother to fever, and most of his hopes somewhere along the way. He didn't say it to draw sympathy. It was just the truth, laid bare in that plain cowboy way. She listened, wondering what kind of man writes a letter asking for a wife when his heart still carries ghosts. Maybe the same kind of woman who answers one. When they reached the small camp he'd mentioned, he helped her down, started a fire, and set a pot of coffee on the coals. Sparks rose into the darkness, vanishing among the stars. She watched him move, efficient, wordless, the firelight catching the rough lines of his face. He was a man shaped by the land, by solitude and hard work. She wondered if there was still room in that kind of life for tenderness. He handed her a tin cup and sat across the flames. "You must be tired from the ride," he said. "A little," she admitted. "But it's beautiful out here." "Different from the city," he gave a small nod. "Out here everything's honest. The land don't pretend to be anything it ain't," she smiled faintly. "People in cities do." His eyes met hers through the flicker of firelight, and for the first time she felt seen, not like an obligation or a stranger to be judged, but as someone starting over just like him. Later, when she lay under the wagon blanket, she couldn't sleep. Coyotes called far off, the fire burned low, and she could hear him shifting on the other side. The thought crossed her mind that this man, this stranger, might become her whole world come morning. It frightened her more than she wanted to admit. By dawn, they were back on the trail. The sun spilled gold over the open plains, touching the grass tops like fire. He pointed out landmarks, a stand of cottonwoods, a creek bend, the ridgeline that marked his property. His voice softened when he spoke of the land. It was more than a place to him. It was memory, survival, home. When the ranch came into view, her breath caught. The cabin stood near a small corral, smoke rising from its chimney, a few horses grazing nearby. It wasn't grand, but it looked steady, weathered, alive. She could almost see herself there, hanging laundry in the wind, hearing the same creak of the porch boards each morning. He helped her down again, and for a moment they just stood there, the wind tugging at her skirt and his hat brim. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetic. "But it's honest work. You'll be safe here. Safe." It was the first time anyone had said that to her in years. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood oil and fresh bread. She noticed a photograph on the shelf, a woman and a child. Her heart tightened, but she didn't ask. He saw her glance and spoke before she could. "My wife and boy. Lost 'em 3 winters back. Fever took the valley." His voice went quiet again. "I wasn't sure I'd ever want to hear another voice in this place." The words hung heavy in the air. She set her small bag down gently, unsure if she was supposed to fill the silence or leave it untouched. She finally said, "Maybe some voices are meant to come later." He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his expression changed. Not warmth yet, not love, but a softening, like a man remembering how to feel again. That evening, she stood on the porch while he tended the horses. The sky burned red over the hills, and for the first time since leaving everything behind, she felt something close to peace. But under that peace another feeling stirred, one she couldn't name. Maybe it was the way he glanced toward the cabin before leading the horses in, or the way the wind carried the faint sound of a woman's laughter she couldn't place, as though the land itself was whispering secrets. When night fell, a storm rolled in sudden and fierce. The wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters. He came in soaked, pulling the door closed behind him. For a moment they stood facing each other breathless, the storm roaring outside. She saw a flash of hesitation in his eyes, something raw and uncertain, before he stepped closer, only to stop halfway, as if fighting something he couldn't name either. The lightning lit his face for a heartbeat, and she thought, maybe this was what hope looked like in a place that had forgotten it. But before either of them could speak, the sound of a horse whinnying in panic cut through the storm, followed by the distant crack of something heavy breaking. He grabbed his coat, eyes already sharp again. "Stay inside," he ordered. She reached out, catching his arm before she could think. "Be careful." He gave a brief nod and vanished into the rain. She stood frozen at the door, heart pounding, watching his shadow disappear into the darkness of the storm, wondering if this land was about to take from her what little she had just begun to find. The thunder rolled deep across the plains, shaking the little cabin to its bones. She stood by the window, the glow of the lantern trembling against the glass, watching the flashes of lightning tear through the sky. Somewhere out there, the cowboy was fighting against the storm, trying to calm his horses. The night had swallowed him whole. Every sound made her heart leap, the slam of a loose shutter, the sharp crack of a branch splitting, the wail of wind curling around the eaves. She'd never known the West could sound alive like that, angry one minute, silent the next. Her fingers gripped the window ledge so hard they hurt, her mind racing with every awful thought of what could be happening outside. Then she saw a faint shape move through the sheets of rain, staggering toward the barn. The lightning flashed again, and she caught a clearer glimpse. It was him, soaked to the bone, pulling something heavy by a rope. One of the horses, she realized, limping and wild-eyed. He was trying to save it, even in a storm like this. The sight hit her harder than she expected. When he finally returned to the porch, drenched and muddy, she rushed to open the door. The wind pushed it back against her, and he had to shoulder it closed behind him. His hat dripped rainwater onto the floorboards. "Barn roof gave way," he said, catching his breath. "Had to move 'em all inside the lean-to. Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling more than she wanted. He shook his head. "Just soaked through. I'll manage." But there was a cut on his arm, thin but bleeding. She grabbed a clean rag from her small bag and handed it to him. "Sit down. Let me see." He hesitated, unused to someone tending to him, but finally gave in. She knelt by the firelight, wrapping the cloth around his arm, the faint smell of rain and dust still clinging to him. The moment felt strangely intimate, two strangers sharing warmth while the storm howled around them. When she finished, he looked down at her with that same quiet steadiness. "You didn't have to. I know," she said softly. "But I wanted to." Something flickered in his eyes, something unspoken. Then he rose, moving to hang his coat by the fire. The flames caught the light in his wet hair, and for a second she could see how tired he was, not just from the storm, but from years of carrying something heavy inside him. They sat in silence for a long while, the only sound the crackling of wet wood. When the wind began to ease, she dared to ask the question that had been sitting on her tongue since she'd arrived. "You said your wife and boy, they passed a few years ago." He nodded without looking up. "Fever took half the valley. Doc came too late, buried him out near the cottonwoods." Her heart ached. "I'm sorry," he shrugged slightly. "Ain't your fault. World's a hard place. You learn to take what's left and keep moving." She stared into the fire, the glow warming her face. "Is that why you sent that letter? Looking for someone to help keep you moving?" His jaw tightened, but there was no anger in it. "I suppose. The land don't run itself, and a man can only talk to the wind for so long." She smiled faintly. "And you thought maybe a mail-order bride would fix that?" That made him look at her finally, a hint of a wry smile touching his mouth. "Didn't figure on fixing anything. Just thought maybe two people who lost something might find a way to keep living." The room went quiet again, the storm dying down to a soft patter. But outside, the air still held a restless charge, as if the land itself was listening. Later that night, when he'd gone to check the horses again, she found herself wandering through the cabin. It was simple: wooden table, rough-hewn chairs, shelves lined with jars of beans and coffee tins. On the mantel sat the small photograph she'd seen earlier. The woman in it had a gentle face, the child perched in her lap laughing at something unseen. She touched the frame lightly, her heart tightening again. Behind the photo, she noticed something else: a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. Without thinking, she pulled it free. It was another letter, written in a shaky hand. She could only make out a few words. "Don't let the land take you too." She quickly put it back when she heard his boots on the porch. Guilt prickled her skin. There were stories buried in this place, and she wasn't sure she was ready to know them yet. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the kind of scent that made the world feel new again. He was already outside when she stepped out, feeding the horses. His shirt sleeves were rolled, revealing the bandaged arm she'd wrapped the night before. "Storm hit hard," he said when he saw her. "Lost part of the fence line. I'll have to ride out later and check the far pasture. Can I help?" she asked. He glanced at her boots, then back at her face. "You sure you're up for that? Ain't easy work?" "I didn't come all this way to sit on the porch." That earned a small smile. "All right then. Grab a pair of gloves from the tack room." They spent the morning mending the fence together, the sun climbing high over the hills. She worked slower than him, her city hands clumsy with the wire, but he never complained. When she caught her finger on a nail, he was there instantly, his rough hand closing around hers to stop the bleeding. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. It was in that quiet closeness that she realized something. The fear she'd carried on the journey here had started to fade. In its place grew something else: respect, maybe even trust. By midday, the wind picked up again, carrying dust from the south. He paused, scanning the horizon. "Storm season's early this year," he murmured. "And that ain't the only trouble brewing." "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. "There's a man in town been buying up land. Wants this place too. Sent word that I ought to sell before the next drought. But this land's been in my family since before the war. I ain't letting it go." "Would he really try to take it from you?" she asked, frowning. "He'll try," he said quietly. "Men like him always do." The tension in his voice sent a chill through her. The idea that someone could come and take everything he'd built, it struck a nerve. She'd come here hoping for a new beginning, not knowing she might have walked right into another kind of storm. That evening, they rode into town for supplies. Willow Creek looked different in daylight, still small but alive with chatter and movement. The general store smelled of coffee and leather, the air thick with the sound of wagon wheels and the clink of spurs. People stopped to stare at her again, whispering as they passed. She tried to ignore it, keeping close behind him. While he loaded feed sacks onto the wagon, a tall man in a fine vest and clean boots approached. His smile was too smooth, his tone too familiar. "You must be the new bride. Heard all about you." She stiffened. "And who are you?" "Just a businessman looking out for the good folks of Willow Creek," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Cole. Your husband here's been stubborn about letting go of land that's too dry to raise cattle on. Thought maybe you could talk some sense into him." Before she could reply, the cowboy stepped between them. "You've said your piece, Cole. Now move along," Cole smirked. "Didn't mean no harm. Just reckon everyone's got their price." The look the cowboy gave him could have cut stone. Cole's grin faded just enough before he turned and walked away. She saw the tightness in the cowboy's jaw as he watched him go, his hand hovering near his belt like a reflex born from long habit. The ride home was quiet. The sun dipped low behind the hills, painting everything gold. She wanted to ask more, but something told her he wasn't ready to talk. When they reached the ranch, the air felt different again, heavy, still, as if holding its breath. He helped her down from the wagon, his touch lingering for a second longer than before. "You did good today," he said softly. "Thank you," she replied. "I'm starting to understand what this land means to you," he nodded. "You'll understand more soon enough." As the last light faded, she looked toward the ridge where the cottonwoods stood, their branches dark against the horizon. For a moment she thought she saw a figure there, a woman in a pale dress standing motionless in the twilight, but when she blinked, it was gone. That night she dreamed of storms again. Only this time, the thunder came not from the sky, but from hooves pounding the earth, drawing closer and closer until she woke, heart racing. The wind was howling outside once more, and the old cabin door rattled against its hinges. Then came the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, measured. She sat up in the darkness, the air thick with the scent of rain and dust, and listened, unsure if it was the cowboy returning from the barn again, or someone else entirely. The footsteps outside came again, closer this time, slow and deliberate against the porch boards. She held her breath, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the door. The lantern's flame quivered, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. Somewhere beyond the window, a horse snorted softly, followed by the dull thud of something brushing against the rail. The latch rattled once, then stopped. Silence, the kind that makes every heartbeat sound too loud. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, as though the night itself were waiting. Finally the door creaked open, not kicked, not forced, just nudged. The cowboy stepped in, rain dripping from his coat, his face hard with concern. "I told you to stay inside," he said quietly, scanning the room. "I thought I heard someone," she whispered. "It wasn't you at first." He looked toward the window, eyes narrowing. "You probably did." He crossed to the door again, pulling his revolver from its holster and peering out into the night. "Tracks will wash away in this rain, but whoever was out there knows this place. Do you think it was that man from town?" He didn't answer right away, just set the latch firm and turned back to her. "Cole's got men. Folks he pays to do things he won't dirty his hands with. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to spook me off this land." Her stomach tightened. "You mean he's trying to scare you into selling?" "Or worse," he said softly. "Out here, when the law's half a day away, folks make their own kind." The next morning the world seemed calm again, as if the night had swallowed its own secrets. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that reflected the pale dawn sky. She watched from the porch as the cowboy saddled his horse. He looked more guarded now, eyes flicking toward the ridgeline every few moments. "I'm riding into the north pasture," he told her. "Need to check if the cattle are still where they ought to be. You stay close to the house today." "I can help around here," she said. "Fix up what the storm broke." He nodded, then hesitated. "If you see anyone you don't recognize, don't wait to ask questions. Go inside and lock the door." When he rode off, the sound of hooves faded slowly into the open land until all she could hear was the faint cry of a hawk. The quiet felt too large after that, too empty. She tried to busy herself, mending torn fabric, sweeping the floor, baking bread like her mother used to, but every small sound outside made her glance toward the door again. By noon, she caught sight of movement near the cottonwoods. A rider, just a shadow against the pale hills. For a while she thought it might be him returning early, but something about the way the horse moved, restless, circling, didn't feel right. Then the rider turned, galloped away, and vanished. That evening, the cowboy came back later than usual, his shirt torn, one sleeve stained dark. "Fence was cut," he said grimly, sliding from the saddle. "And 3 head of cattle gone." Her eyes widened. "Do Do you think it was them? I know it was. He dropped the saddlebag with a heavy thud. They're testing me, seeing how far I'll bend before I break. He washed up at the basin, his hands rough and trembling. She could see it now, the wear, the quiet fury beneath the calm. You should tell the sheriff, she said softly. He gave a dry laugh. Sheriff works for Cole, always has. Out here justice costs money and I'm the poorest man in the valley. That night they ate in silence. The wind had turned cold again, whispering against the window. He kept glancing at the door, as if half expecting someone to knock. Finally he spoke, his voice low. I ain't afraid of men like him, but I didn't figure you'd have to walk into the middle of it. I'm not sorry I came, she said. Maybe I was meant to. He looked up, his eyes searching hers, but he didn't say what was behind that look. Instead, he stood, took his coat, and said he'd be outside checking the gate. When the door shut behind him, she felt the emptiness again. Thick, uneasy, alive. The days that followed carried a strange rhythm. Morning chores, quiet dinners, long silences that said more than words. She began to learn his world, the way he watched the sky for signs of rain, the way he spoke to his horses like old friends, the way he never complained no matter how much work waited. But there was a sadness to him too, one that lingered even when he smiled. One afternoon, while hanging laundry near the corral, she saw a small figure walking up the path. A boy, maybe 10 years old, with a satchel slung over his shoulder. He waved politely as he came closer. Ma'am, he said shyly, are you the new lady at the ranch? I suppose I am, she said with a smile. What's your name? Tommy. My pa works down at the feed store. Mr. Cole said to tell your husband he's got a letter waiting in town. Her smile faded slightly. Did Mr. Cole give it to you himself? Yes, ma'am. Said it's important. She thanked him and watched him trot back down the road. Inside, she placed the folded note on the table, staring at it for a long time before opening it. The words were short, but sharp enough to cut. You can still walk away before it's too late. The land isn't worth dying for. When the cowboy came home that evening, she handed him the note. He read it once, then burned it in the fire without a word. Maybe he's bluffing, she said. No, he answered quietly. Men like Cole don't bluff. They warn you once. That night sleep came slow. She lay awake, listening to the soft crack of the dying fire, wondering if this land really was cursed, like the old women in town whispered. They said the valley had once belonged to a tribe driven out by force, that their spirits still walked the hills, guarding what had been taken. Whether it was superstition or not, she couldn't tell. But sometimes, when the wind came down from the mountains, she thought she heard faint voices carried on it. As the weeks passed, the tension only deepened. Someone broke the corral gate one night. Another time, she found the barn door open, tools missing. He worked harder, slept less. There were moments she saw fear flicker behind his steady eyes, but he never let it take root. One evening, after another long day, he sat at the table sharpening his knife, the steady scrape filling the room. If anything happens, he said suddenly, there's a rifle under the floorboard near the bed. You'll know what to do, she froze. Don't talk like that. I have to, he said, voice low. I can handle most things, but if they come while I'm gone, they won't, she interrupted, but her words felt hollow. Outside, the wind began to rise again. The sky turned the color of smoke. She crossed the room and placed her hand on his arm. You're not alone anymore, she said softly. Whatever comes, we face it together. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he set the knife down, eyes fixed on the fire. Together, he echoed. The next day, while he was out fixing the outer fence, she decided to ride to town for supplies. The trail was quiet, too quiet. When she reached the general store, a few folks nodded politely, but most looked away. She could feel it. Rumors spreading, whispers about the ranch, about her. Inside, the storekeeper hesitated before bagging her flour and coffee. Ma'am, he said finally, lowering his voice. If I were you, I'd keep my distance from Cole's men. They've been riding out that way after dark. Her hands went cold. Why hasn't anyone stopped them? He sighed. Because folks around here still remember what happened to the last man who tried. She left town quickly, heart pounding. Halfway home near the ridge, she spotted smoke, thin and rising from the direction of the ranch. Panic gripped her chest. She kicked her horse into a gallop, the world blurring around her. When she reached the clearing, her worst fear hit her. Part of the barn was on fire, the flames crawling up the side like hungry fingers. She jumped down, running toward it, coughing from the smoke. The horses screamed inside. She grabbed a bucket, tried to throw water, but the heat drove her back. Then she heard a shout behind her. He was there, sprinting toward the flames, his face streaked with soot and sweat. Together they fought it, hauling water from the trough, choking on the smoke until finally the fire gave out, leaving only blackened wood and silence. They stood there, both shaking, watching the embers glow. "It was them," he said hoarsely. "They came while I was up the ridge, tried to finish what they started." She looked at him, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" He turned toward the horizon, where the last traces of smoke drifted away. His expression hardened into something she hadn't seen before, resolve mixed with quiet fury. "We're gonna make them regret thinking they could take this place," he said. But even as he said it, the wind carried a sound that neither of them could place. A faint whistle, almost like laughter, coming from the dark edge of the hills. And in that moment, she couldn't tell if the real danger was the men who wanted the land, or the land itself. The days that followed the fire were restless and heavy with unease. Smoke still lingered in the air, clinging to the burnt edges of the barn like a ghost that refused to leave. She spent mornings helping him repair what they could, but no matter how hard they worked, the feeling of being watched never left her. Every time the wind rustled the grass, every time a crow called from the ridge, she found herself glancing toward the horizon. The cowboy's eyes had changed too, more alert now, sharper. He rode farther each day, checking fences and tracks, and when he came back at night, he said little, his face unreadable. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the cottonwoods, he came home with dirt on his boots and a deep crease in his brow. "They're moving closer," he said quietly. "Found boot prints by the creek. 3 men, maybe 4. They ain't just scouting anymore." Her hands trembled as she set down the kettle. "You think they'll come back soon?" He nodded once. "Sooner than we'd like." She watched him oil his rifle by the fire, the way he moved slow and sure, like a man preparing for something he couldn't avoid. "Can't the townsfolk help?" she asked. "Surely someone," he shook his head. "Cole's got half the valley in his pocket. The rest are too scared to choose sides." The truth of it settled in the air between them like dust. Out here the law meant little. Justice belonged to the man who could hold his ground longest. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind was calm, the world too quiet. She lay awake listening to the faint creak of the porch boards as he paced outside. The lantern's glow stretched long across the walls, flickering with each step he took. Somewhere out there under the cover of darkness, someone was waiting for him to slip. Just before dawn, she rose and stepped outside. He was sitting on the porch steps, his hat low over his eyes, rifle across his knees. The early light painted the land in pale gold. She sat beside him in silence for a moment before speaking. "You could still leave," she said softly. "Sell what's left, go somewhere new." He gave a short laugh. "This land's got my blood in it, my pa's too. If I walk away now, I might as well bury both of us again." "But what if it cost you more?" she asked. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers in the half-light. "Then I reckon that's the price I'll pay." By mid-morning, he'd saddled his horse and ridden out to check the north boundary again. She stayed behind, gathering what she could from the garden, trying to keep her mind busy. Around noon, she heard the faint sound of hooves, too many to be just him. Her heart quickened. She stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the sun. Down the trail came 2 riders, strangers, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They didn't slow as they approached, and every instinct told her to step back. "Morning, ma'am," one of them called out, a thin smile twisting his face. "We're looking for your husband. Heard he's been causing a bit of trouble for our employer." She gripped the porch railing. "He's not here." "Shame," the man said, spitting into the dirt. "We just wanted to have a friendly chat." His companion snickered, dismounting to glance around the yard. "Nice place. Shame if it caught fire again." Her stomach turned cold. "You should leave." "Now why would we do that?" the man drawled, taking a step closer. "We just came to deliver a message." Before she could respond, the distant sound of hooves thundered from the hills. Both men turned, startled. The cowboy appeared over the ridge, riding hard, dust trailing behind him. He reached the yard in seconds, rifle raised, eyes sharp. "Get off my land," he said, voice low but deadly steady. The men hesitated, glancing at each other. One tried to smirk. "Ain't worth dying over, friend." "Then ride," he replied. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the strangers mounted up, muttering curses as they turned their horses and galloped off. When they disappeared into the distance, he lowered his rifle, his breath still hard from the ride. She rushed to him. "You shouldn't have faced them alone." "I've been facing worse most my life," he said, eyes still on the horizon. "But it's different now. They know you're here. That changes things. Then what do we do?" she whispered. "We wait," he said simply, "and we be ready." That night he set traps near the barn and left the lantern burning low. The moon was high and cold, the stars sharp as needles. They sat by the fire, both pretending not to notice how close they were sitting. He told her stories about his father, the first winter they nearly starved, the time lightning struck the old oak near the creek, how his mother used to sing to calm the storms. She listened quietly, feeling the walls between them thinning. But beneath that warmth, danger pulsed like a hidden drum. Neither said it, but both felt it, the sense that something was coming. A few nights later, the first sign arrived. A dead calf left near the gate. No bullet holes, no marks of an animal attack, just laid there as if to say, "We can reach you any time." He buried it without a word. 2 days after that, the water trough was poisoned. He found the slick residue floating on top, the smell sharp and strange. "They're trying to drive us out," he muttered. "Bit by bit. You can't fight them all," she pleaded. He looked at her, something fierce and unyielding in his gaze. "I ain't fighting for me anymore." That evening, dark clouds gathered again over the plains. The wind carried the smell of rain mixed with smoke from far away. She stood by the window, watching him saddle 2 horses. "You're leaving?" "I'm going to town," he said. "Cole's men won't stop unless I end this." Her heart thudded. "You'll get yourself killed." He stepped close, his voice softer now. "If I don't, they'll come here next. I can't let that happen." "Then let me come with you." He shook his head. "If something goes wrong, someone needs to stay." She swallowed hard, trying to hold back the fear rising in her throat. "At least promise you'll come back." He touched the brim of his hat and gave a small nod. "You have my word." She watched him ride into the storm until he disappeared beyond the ridge. Hours passed. The wind howled, and thunder rolled across the valley again. She lit a lantern, pacing the floor, her ears straining for any sound of returning hooves. Near midnight, she heard it. Faint at first, then louder. She ran to the window, but the figure that emerged wasn't him. A single rider, face hidden by rain, moving slow, almost cautious. She froze, heart pounding, watching as he stopped by the gate. For a long moment he just sat there, staring toward the cabin. Then he turned and vanished into the trees. She waited until dawn before exhaustion pulled her into uneasy sleep. When she woke, the sun had risen pale and cold, and he was still gone. By noon, the sound of a wagon approached from the distance. Relief flooded her until she realized it wasn't his horse leading it. Instead, it was the boy, Tommy from the feed store, his small face pale and frightened. "Ma'am," he said, breathless, "you gotta come quick." They took him. The world tilted. "What do you mean?" "They caught him in town, Mr. Cole's men. Folks say they're holding him out near the old mine past the ridge." She didn't think. She just moved. Grabbing her shawl, the rifle he'd taught her to use, she saddled the second horse. Tommy tried to stop her, but she was already riding hard toward the hills, her heart hammering in her chest. The trail to the mine was rough, lined with black rock and dry brush. The wind whistled low through the canyons, carrying the smell of dust and iron. She reached the ridge as the sky began to turn orange with the setting sun. Down below she saw them, 3 men by a fire and him tied to a post, head bowed. Her breath caught. Rage replaced fear. She moved quietly down the slope, staying low behind the rocks. Every sound seemed too loud, the crunch of gravel, the snort of her horse. One of the men laughed. "Cole'll be here soon. Said he wants to make an example." "Of what?" another asked. "Of anyone who don't sell when told." She raised the rifle, hands trembling. The distance was far, the light fading fast, but she couldn't wait. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed through the canyon, scattering birds from the cliffs. One of the men fell back, shouting. The others spun toward the sound. Then chaos. He wrenched against the ropes, kicking out at the nearest man. She fired again, and the second dropped to his knees. The third ran toward the horses, shouting for help. She reloaded with shaking hands, but the rifle jammed. Below, he broke free, diving for the fallen gun. A flash of lightning lit the canyon just as Cole appeared at the edge of the firelight, pistol drawn, shouting orders. The storm had followed her there, dark clouds swirling above like judgment. She ducked behind a boulder, the wind whipping dust into her eyes. Another gunshot rang out close, too close. She looked down, and for a moment their eyes met across the fire's glow. His look wasn't fear. It was something deeper. something that said, "Don't stop now." The rain began again, cold and heavy. The gunfire echoed between the cliffs, and as she raised the rifle one last time, lightning split the sky wide open. Somewhere in that flash of blinding white, the world seemed to hold its breath. Everything, the land, the storm, their fate, balanced on a single heartbeat. Then came the sound that changed everything. The crack of thunder drowned out the last gunshot. For a moment, the whole world seemed to vanish into light and noise. When the echo faded, all that remained was the hiss of rain and the faint crackle of dying fire. Smoke drifted through the canyon, and she could barely see through it, her hands trembling as she clutched the rifle. Somewhere below, a body hit the ground with a dull thud. She didn't know if it was him or them. She stumbled forward, sliding down the muddy slope, her breath sharp and uneven. The rain made the rocks slick, and twice she fell, scraping her palms raw. When she reached the bottom, the fire had nearly gone out, only embers glowing in the dark. She saw two of Cole's men lying still, their guns half buried in the mud. The third was gone, his horse tracks fading into the storm. Then she saw him. The cowboy was on his knees, blood streaking down his temple, his hands still gripping the pistol he'd wrestled from one of them. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, but his eyes were open. She ran to him, dropping beside him in the wet dirt. "You're alive," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain. He managed a faint smile. "You sure do have a knack for showing up at the right time." She helped him lean against a rock, trying to steady him. "You shouldn't have come alone," he murmured. "Neither should you," she said, voice trembling but firm. "We're not running anymore. Not from them, not from anything." The sound of hooves echoed again, faint but growing louder. Through the rain, a figure appeared, Cole himself riding slow, his slicker flapping like dark wings. He stopped a few yards away, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "Didn't think you'd make it this far," Cole sneered, raising his revolver. "You could have walked away, cowboy. Could have saved yourself some pain." The cowboy pushed himself up, staggering to his feet despite the blood on his shirt. "This land was never yours to take," he said. "Not from my father. Not from me," Cole laughed coldly. "You think anyone will care who wins this little fight? The law's mine. The land's mine. Even if I leave you both in this mud, nobody'll come asking questions." She stepped forward then, placing herself between them before she could think. "You've already taken everything from enough people," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "You can't buy what was built with heart." Cole's smirk faltered for a split second. The cowboy saw his chance. With one swift move, he raised his gun and fired. The sound cracked through the rain, sharp and final. Cole staggered back, a look of shock flickering across his face before he crumpled to the ground. For a long while, no one spoke. The rain poured harder, washing the dirt from his boots, the blood from the earth carrying it all away into the creek below. She dropped to her knees, staring at the still figure. The cowboy stood motionless, breathing hard, his hand still gripping the gun. "It's over," she said quietly. He looked down at her, the stormlight reflecting in his eyes. "No," he murmured, his voice low and tired. "It's just finished. They left the canyon at sunrise." The rain had cleared, leaving the air fresh and cold. Mist hung low over the fields as they rode back side by side. The land stretched out before them, scarred but still alive. When they reached the ranch, the first thing she saw was the old cottonwoods, their branches swaying gently in the morning light. Smoke rose from the chimney where the fire still burned low inside. The cabin looked small but strong, as if it had waited for them. He slid off his horse slowly, wincing from his wounds. She ran to help him, but he waved her off with a faint grin. "I can manage." She smiled through the tears she'd been holding back since the canyon. "You always say that." Inside, the warmth wrapped around them like an old blanket. She cleaned his wounds carefully, her hands steady now. He watched her quietly, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. When she was done, she sat beside him near the fire. "You know," he said after a long silence, "I don't reckon I ever believed in second chances. Not after what this land took from me." She looked into the flames. "Maybe it didn't take. It just waited. For the right time. For the right person," he smiled faintly. "You talk like someone who's never seen how mean the world can be." "Oh, I've seen it," she said. "But I've also seen what survives it." The wind outside shifted, brushing against the windows like a sigh. He leaned back, letting out a long breath. "When I first wrote that letter, I didn't expect anyone to answer," he said quietly. "I just needed to believe someone still might. She took his hand gently, her thumb tracing the calluses on his palm. You were right to believe. Days passed and the valley began to heal. The fires were rebuilt, the fences mended, and for the first time, peace settled over the ranch. The townsfolk started talking. Some said Cole's men scattered after his death. Others said they rode east and never came back. No one came asking questions, and that suited them fine. One morning, the boy Tommy came riding up the trail again, carrying a small envelope. From the sheriff, he said, handing it over. Inside was a single note, formal words stating that the land was now legally his. Cole's holdings had been seized by the state. She looked at the paper, then at him. He gave a soft, tired laugh. Guess justice does come late out here. The days grew longer, the air warmer. Spring rolled across the plains, painting everything green again. Sometimes, when she walked past the cottonwoods, she felt the weight of all that had happened. The fear, the fire, the loss, but also the strange peace that followed. One evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The sky glowed deep orange and gold, and for the first time the horizon didn't look lonely anymore. He turned to her. You ever think about going back east? She shook her head. There's nothing waiting for me there. Everything I was meant to find, I found here. He was quiet for a moment. I used to think love was something that happens once. You lose it and that's that. But maybe it's like this land. You think it's dead, and then the rain comes and everything grows again. She smiled, her eyes warm in the fading light. Then maybe we both got lucky with the rain. He reached over and took her hand. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full, peaceful, alive. When the first stars appeared, she rested her head on his shoulder. The wind carried the scent of the prairie grass and distant pine, the same air that had once carried their fear. Now it felt like home. Far off, thunder rumbled again, not the kind that promised danger, but the kind that spoke of life returning, of clouds rolling gentle across an endless sky. He looked out at the land that had nearly broken him, the land he'd fought for, and his voice was soft when he finally spoke. You came here because you thought love was impossible, he said. Now look what you've done. She smiled, her eyes glistening in the firelight. I didn't do it alone. The world outside grew quiet except for the rustle of the grass and the soft creak of the porch boards. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, whispering something almost like a song, low, tender, endless. And for the first time since the letter had crossed that long distance between two lonely souls, there was nothing left to run from. The ranch, the land, the love they'd found. They were all part of the same story now. The days would still be hard. There would be droughts, storms, long winters. But when she looked at him, his face worn by years and sunlight, his eyes steady and kind, she knew they'd weather them together. In the heart of that quiet valley, under the same sky that had once watched them fight for everything they had, peace finally took root, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a horse's hooves echoed faintly, steady and strong, just a reminder of the life they had built, and the promise that this time it would last.